Hey, good evening. I'm Karen Bordelot. I'm the executive editor of the New Bedford Light, and on behalf of our team, I would like to welcome you to tonight's community conversation on housing. Tonight's conversation is directly related to the Light's Housing in Distress series, which has been reported by staff writer Grace Ferguson. Our esteemed panelists, all leaders in the housing industry, have graciously agreed to join us here tonight to add their expertise to the subject. This is the last of 6 community conversations this year, all designed to provide a 360-degree view of critical issues that face our city and region. For us at The Light, these sessions are a face-to-face form of journalism and another platform on which to fulfill our mission, which is to expose, to examine, to educate, and to engage. These forums are intended to be civil discourses that provide the audience with divergent viewpoints. You will not agree with everything that is said here. You may not agree with anything that is said here, but we are sure you'll keep an open mind and give our panelists the respect they deserve. I now have the pleasure of introducing Grace Ferguson, one of the Light's star reporters, as the moderator for tonight's event. Grace joined The Light in 2022 and has primarily focused her reporting on housing, transportation, and economic development. She graduated summa cum laude from Boston University in 2022 with a bachelor's degree in journalism. While in college, she worked on investigations for WBUR and WGBH, Boston's public radio stations, and she also led a team of campus news reporters during the pandemic for WTBU, the Boston University student radio station. Please welcome Grace.
Thank you, Karen, for that introduction, and I am absolutely thrilled to introduce this incredible panel we've assembled tonight. Josh Amaral, in the white sweater, from the City of New Bedford. Josh proudly serves the City of New Bedford as the Director of the Office of Housing and Community Development, a mission-driven department devoted to responding to community needs, neighborhood revitalization, developing housing and public facilities, alleviating homelessness, and supporting the city's nonprofit partners. A lifelong New Bedford resident and graduate of New Bedford High School, Josh also holds a BA in Political Science and a Master of Business Administration from UMass Dartmouth. And then second from the right here, we have Ben Foreman, Mass Inc. Policy Center. Ben coordinates the nonpartisan think tank's research agenda and oversees production of research reports. Prior to joining Mass Inc., he served as a researcher at the Brookings Institution. With previous positions at the District of Columbia Department of Parks and Recreation and the economic consulting firm Nathan Associates, he also has experience in city government and the private sector. Next, on the far right, we have Renee Ledbetter of New Bedford Shannon. Renee has served as director of New Bedford Shannon since August 2019. As director, she is responsible for managing all prevention and intervention initiatives and programming for this community safety initiative focused on youth at risk of gang violence. Renee also serves as director of youth ministry and faith formation coordinator at Our Lady of Assumption Church, president for United Interfaith Action, and as president for New Bedford NAACP. Renee attended Mount Ida College and Newberry College, completing a Bachelor of Arts in Science in Communications with a concentration in Human Services. She previously held positions at UMass Dartmouth and the City of Dallas. And last but not least, we have on the far left, Chris Vitale from the town of Dartmouth. With 7 years of service in local government, Chris currently serves as the co-interim town administrator for the town of Dartmouth. In this role, Chris oversees the day-to-day operations of the town and plays an essential role in the implementation of the community's capital plan. Previously, Chris held the position of Director of Economic Development and Communications for the town of Bristol, Rhode Island, that is. He is also an active commissioner for the Southeastern Regional Planning and Economic Development District. And Chris earned a Master's of Arts in Strategic Communications from the University of Iowa and a Bachelor of Science in Business from Roger Williams University. Please welcome our panelists. I think we have a really incredible discussion ahead of us tonight. And Renee, I'd like to start with you. Can you tell us what it's like to be a tenant in New Bedford right now?
Well, I think for the most part, it's a struggle to be a tenant, not just New Bedford, but Fairhaven, Dartmouth, most of the surrounding area. And it's a balance. You have to try to figure out whether or not you're going to pay your rent, be late on something else, pay your electric. It's a lot. I also think in New Bedford, it's a struggle finding housing that is safe and in good condition that people can actually live in without paying $2,000 a month. So I think it's a struggle, and I think it's fair to say that yes, it's important, for landlords to be able to, because like one of my landlords said to me, it's a business, it's not personal. So I get it, and it's their home, and they have the right to raise the rent, but the incomes haven't changed, so that needs to be taken into consideration. So right now for New Bedford and the surrounding areas, you're going to see more and more homeless people.
Ben, you helped create the Housing for All report earlier this year, which was a sweeping, comprehensive look at housing in New Bedford. One of the findings was that Greater New Bedford is short 4,100 housing units today and needs to build 8,700 by the end of the decade to keep up with demand. Can you explain to us in the simplest terms you're able, what is causing the rents to skyrocket the way that they are?
I think in the simplest terms, rents are increasing because the number of households is growing and the number of housing units in the community isn't nearly growing fast enough to keep up. So there's a shortage.
Mm-hmm. What were some other major findings that you found in that report about what's contributing to the housing shortage?
Well, I think we're seeing a lot of household growth, much more household growth in the city than in the surrounding communities, but household growth outpacing the number of new housing units in both the city and the suburbs. And that's true throughout the region, throughout the country, really. And so everywhere in the U.S., we're dealing with this challenge. But it's really hard for the market to solve here because the price to construct housing is just so expensive in Massachusetts. And in order to make the economics work, you have to charge a lot for it to break even. And so we have this situation where we can't produce because the numbers don't work. But if we don't produce more, there's a shortage and the rents keep going up. So we're kind of damned if you do, damned if you don't situation that is going to take a lot of creative thinking and collaboration to get out of. And I think the whole sort of impetus for the report was the city recognized that it was facing this challenge. And I think the leaders of the community recognizes that it had implications for the economy, it had implications for the people, and it had to be a number one priority. And I think there's been a lot of leadership from Josh and others in the city to get their heads around this. And I think it's great that so many people are coming up to the third floor of the library on a night like this to talk about it, because that's the only way we're going to fix it. It's a difficult problem.
And that's a great transition to my next question. Josh, can you tell us a bit about what the city's been up to recently to address the housing crisis?
Yes. Good evening. You mentioned the Housing for All report that Mass Inc. worked on with the New Bedford Regeneration Committee. That really followed about a year after the city released Building New Bedford, which is sort of our comprehensive strategy to attack our housing shortage. That plan encompasses 22 different strategies over 6 different buckets that range from strengthening nonprofit developers and strengthening homeless services, all the way to using underutilized or vacant municipal properties to convert to housing. I would say the biggest part of the strategy, the core of it really, is recruiting development in New Bedford and guiding development in a way that goes beyond what we have done before, goes beyond what most municipalities do, and I think is pioneering. I think we hear from a lot of developers, they wish every community did some of the same work. So we identify properties that are vacant. We identify potential development sites. We try to play matchmaker with potential developers that might come and develop units on those sites. You had a great piece today, Grace, on the economics of housing construction, and Ben had alluded to this as well. The cost to produce a new unit of housing is more than it's worth to produce that housing. And so we fundamentally have this math problem to solve where we have to figure out how to fill that financial gap. There are a number of subsidy programs out there, a small number of them that are under the city's control, a pretty significant number of them that are under the state and federal government's control. And so the key to success for us is making sure that developers have access to those resources and have just enough to make their projects work and not too much, or else they're not leaving enough for other developers. The reality is we also need to build a pipeline of emerging developers, local developers, contractors, painters, real estate professionals, and everyone else, because local people and local developers, not only do they care more about their tenants generally and have a little bit more of an understanding of what the local context is, but they also are able to operate much more efficiently. And so in a market where we see units cost regularly over $500,000 to produce, my house isn't worth $500,000. Most houses in the city are not worth $500,000, and yet the cost to construct one apartment in a large apartment building is between $500,000 and $600,000 in some of the projects you see here downtown. So those are all subsidized heavily by the government. But yet some local, smaller developers, enterprising folks can get those same units built for $200,000, $300,000. We just don't have enough of them. And then the programs and subsidies we have are not really flexible enough for most of them to access. We're also competing for development with every other city like us. And so we need to do more to do that. Part of that is regional collaboration. Part of that's making sure we can get housing built where we need to. But I would say that the core of the strategy is that we're open for business. We want developers to come to us and work with us, and we can help them get projects built because that's what our residents need.
Chris, can you tell us about what Dartmouth is doing to address the housing crisis?
Absolutely, and good evening. So earlier this year, we had a housing production plan which had lapsed with the town of Dartmouth. Working with our community preservation committee, as well as the state, we were able to obtain funding so that we could begin the planning process for a new housing production plan. The goal of that plan ultimately is to help us get to our 10% affordable housing threshold for inventory. However, just like Josh alluded to, when you alleviate the burden of finding housing for one class of people, it opens up additional housing opportunities in other areas where maybe we're stretching to afford one apartment. You can find something a little more affordable that makes more sense for you. So as part of the housing production plan, we have contracted with SERPID, our regional planning agency. And as part of that, they're working on a comprehensive study, both of where the population in Dartmouth and the area, the region is going. In addition to that, they're looking at our zoning and where's the potential for development. And at its heaviest use or heaviest possible use, what could go there? Not necessarily what will go there, but what could go there. And ultimately, with that information, number one, bringing our stakeholders in and coming up with those clear, defined goals of what we can do over the next several years. But number two is it'll also help the town figure out where to best invest its money. So, Josh mentioned, well, what's the burden for developers to fund these projects? Well, like developers, communities also have to fund infrastructure to support these developments. And one of those unspoken things is that we're ready to receive development in certain areas, even if we want them there. And it's partially true, but sometimes it's not so much the case. Sometimes we need a little additional legwork in there. So I think having this information will help us figure out where to best spend those dollars. And I'm pleased to say, even while we're doing planning, we're still seeking grant funds, and we were awarded a couple $1 million here this past month to help with an affordable housing development that's going in central Dartmouth. So,
thank you. One thing you mentioned was this 10% threshold. Can you just explain that briefly for people who aren't familiar with 40B?
Absolutely. So for 40B, the state of Massachusetts requires that each municipality has a minimum of 10% of its housing stock dedicated for affordable housing. So income-based residents. So every year, the federal government and Massachusetts come out with income thresholds depending on your household size, essentially set aside for people who might not meet the area income.
Ben, could you tell us about what the research shows about what role the suburbs of gateway cities have to play in addressing the housing crisis?
Well, we have looked at where the affordable housing is in each gateway city region of the state. And, the suburbs, in many cases, have as much affordable rental housing as the gateway cities do. But they have very little rental housing to begin with. So, it's the same fraction off a very small base. And so that means almost all the rental housing in each of the regions of the state, including in this area, is located in the city. So, that has real implications, I think, for the economy when there's a shortage of rental housing and people who are looking to locate to a region to take a job at a growing business don't see an opportunity to relocate. So I think when it comes to rental housing, from an economic standpoint, the suburbs aren't really serving the economy well by underproducing to the extent that they are. There's also clearly a very significant fair housing issue. If renters tend to be lower income and you don't produce rental housing, then you're not creating the opportunity for people to choose among the different types of communities in our Commonwealth. You're walling them off and creating exclusion and concentrated poverty. And I think we're paying a very huge price for 50 years of suburbs acting in that way and concentrating the poverty in our cities and undermining the potential of children in cities because our urban students are mostly attending very high poverty schools that don't have the resources to serve their students well. And we're depriving all the students in our suburban communities of the opportunity to learn among a diverse student population and gain experience in terms of the world and workplace that they're actually going to live in and be able to contribute productively that way. So I think much of our conversation today is based around this 40B statute, which is 40, 50 years old, and has done a pretty good job in some ways of creating more rental housing, more multifamily housing, but clearly not enough to meet the needs of the market, and certainly not enough to actually create economic integration in any meaningful way. And I think that we don't talk about that too much in Massachusetts, and it's something that really deserves far more attention in our policy discussions.
One of the recommendations in the Housing for All report was to have more regional coordination. And in fact, part of the Building New Bedford Housing Plan that came out in 2023 was to have a regional approach to this issue. So Josh and Chris, what can you tell me about the coordination that's happening between New Bedford and Dartmouth?
Well, so aside from getting to know Chris better over the last few months, which really started at the panel discussion we had at the launch of that report, building those relationships, having contacts in the towns to reach out to and coordinate in. It's been largely theoretical to this point, but I think in a perfect world, right, the way that works is perhaps we're approached by a development that needs a lot of land. There are very few parcels of land in New Bedford that are available of significant size for like a multi-building, multi-family complex. Like Dartmouth has Solimar that comes to mind as something like that, sort of a sprawling complex, and maybe it's a little bit denser than that. But if a developer were to approach us and that's sort of their preferred means of development, we don't really have much for them. And so we could say, hey, I don't know where that could go here. We could come up with some sites where maybe you have to demolish some stuff, which is costly. But maybe you could go talk to Dartmouth, right? There's some available land there, and perhaps Dartmouth's study will identify some sites that are key for that. Where the towns might have infrastructure needs, the state has launched a Housing Works program to help offset the cost of infrastructure. Of course, developers face pretty much the same financing gaps in the towns. I think the rents generally would be a little bit higher in a place like Dartmouth or Fairhaven, but the cost of construction would be pretty much the same as it is in New Bedford. The gap might be, 10% smaller, but it's still significant. And so a lot of the funding sources that we would advise developers to use can be gained in the towns as well. I think we would be supportive of that in a lot of cases where resources are sort of earmarked toward gateway cities. I would advocate for an approach where if a gateway city says, please give this to our town partner, this would help our problem just as much as anybody's. We don't necessarily need it to go to Greater Boston. We need it in our region. We need to produce units here. And I think that's an approach that we could find some success with in meeting out those resources. And lastly, when it comes to those subsidy sources, geography comes into play. There are a number of programs that will only make one award per municipality per year, or two per year. And so we're sure to have a pipeline in New Bedford multi-years out for each program. But Dartmouth or Fairhaven might not have projects in the queue for those. And we'd like them to, and we'd support them in navigating that. It could be kind of a niche business. So we have a team that sort of specializes in it. And so we could try to arrange that. I think as a region, we leave money on the table. And so I know, speaking for myself and speaking for the administration in New Bedford, when there's a new announcement of housing funds and where it's going, we look and go, hey, did we get any? Why didn't New Bedford get any? And I think our region should look at it that way. Not just what is New Bedford getting, but what did Fairhaven get? What did Acushnet get? What did Freetown get? Because they're all eligible. We could all take advantage of these resources. It's in effect free money to come and solve our housing challenges, but we need to use our expertise to access that. So we're willing to do that. I think in an optimal world, we're doing that, and we're able to double, triple, quadruple the amount of resources coming into our region to solve this important problem.
Yeah, so from the town government's perspective, I agree a lot with what Josh said, and I would say definitely really the amount of grant funding that is coming up.
Could you check your mic? Can people hear Chris?
Is it all the way up?
Can we make sure that's on?
Thank you.
Now we can hear you. All right,
Thanks.
go ahead.
So I was saying is I agree a lot with what Josh said. And when it comes to grant opportunities, there's always money on the table. And it's something where really with each grant application, we sit down and say, what do we have in the pipeline so that we can keep certain initiatives moving. And, I always say the worst thing you can do is you can get grant funds and then not spend them. And it's the worst feeling to have to turn them back. So trying to get more shovel-ready projects to the forefront so that when these grant opportunities do come up, we can work with our regional partners so that we can put a competitive application forward. Sometimes it's not for lack of trying. It's just there is a lot of people who are competing for those same dollars. And, again, like Josh said, sometimes you're competing with your neighboring communities, depending on the grant program. Other times, there is an opportunity to take that regional approach. And in those cases, definitely something to explore further. The other bit is, when it comes to a regional approach, I think it is looking at the economies of scale in terms of technical assistance, in terms of some of that initial planning work that maybe a site inspector would go out and look for, or a commercial developer, for example, will contact the municipality looking for some information that might not be readily available, or might need a little bit more digging, or just in the sense of, hey, are you, a developer-friendly community? So trying to get that information readily available and having it accessible again. So when opportunities do arise and there is a developer that, might not be the best fit for Dartmouth and New Bedford would be a better fit, or vice versa, that information is there so we can collaborate better. So definitely opportunities like that is, certainly what we'd want to explore further.
And we'll definitely get back to some of the economics and developer cultivation later in the conversation. But first, I want to turn back to Renee. You've been advocating for affordable housing as part of your work with United Interfaith Action. And so could you tell us about some of the policies that you've been advocating for through that work?
Okay, the one that sticks on the top of my head is inclusionary zoning. That's one of the larger policies which would allow, for example, Kings Highway. I know Josh is sick of hearing me say this, but Kings Highway, you can build plenty of apartments and on the bottom still have stores and community resources for those that may need it. And there's a whole shopping center that's practically empty. Over in that area, and that's where the train's gonna go. But we talk about, there's no room in New Bedford, but there's no land, but there's property. So, there is some room if we have the inclusionary zoning. So that's one of the larger policies that we really wanted to pass, because and it's great, Dartmouth wants to kick in and do all this, but the income guidelines do not allow for a lot of people to live in those places, whether you have grant money or not. That's why the grant money goes back, because they don't have enough people that qualify for that grant money. So I think, some of the other initiatives they're kind of doing, the city's doing a little bit. They touched upon some of it. And we also talked about the accessory dwelling units. And so that's one of the things that we push for as well, the zoning for
That
that.
accessory dwelling unit was that the state legalized by right across the state, so-called in-law apartments or granny flats is what a lot of people call them. And so you can build that without having to run into local zoning opposition to that.
Right. They just weren't doing it in Bedford, so. But, yeah, so that's pretty much what I can think of right now, but.
Well, I want to talk about that inclusionary zoning policy that you advocated for that would set aside 10 to 20% of apartments for low-income households in any new development. Josh, I understand that the city is not for inclusionary zoning. Can you articulate what the city's position is on that?
Yeah, thank you. I think it's an important subject. And we'd certainly see circumstances in cities across Massachusetts, across the country, where inclusionary zoning is necessary, is vital to protecting their housing market. It's not a perfect fit for us for a variety of reasons. One is, going back to the economics of housing construction, the reality is that you need government sources to subsidize almost all the projects that we have. When you look down Union Street, there's 125 or so new units coming online or already online, and about 100 of those are income restricted already. So 100 out of 125 are income restricted out of necessity, frankly. And so it sort of obviates the need in my mind for a requirement to set aside 10 or 20% of the units, when the reality is most major projects are going to have 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 80% of their units income restricted already just out of financial necessity. What I fear with inclusionary zoning is that when there are small projects like 10 or 12 unit projects or 15 unit projects that might be developed by one of those smaller emerging developers that don't know how to go out and get the grant funds and don't know how to develop them, but they can build this project and get it built in a year or less and get people living in there, which is like warp speed in the housing development world, as opposed to waiting 3 or 4 years to line up all the financing to do it. We want them to build those units. We have plenty of developers that would like to take advantage of all the grant programs and all the subsidy programs to get units built. That's not our shortage. The shortage is really these smaller projects that could be market projects and get them moving that way. Secondly, or lastly, I'll say, Renee's right. There are a lot of people out there who make just a little bit more than the income guidelines to live in quote unquote affordable, low income, quote unquote income restricted units. They make just a little bit more than that, which is usually the 60% of the area median income. And so if you're between 60 and 80% of the area median income, you might be living paycheck to paycheck like most people are, and yet you're not eligible to live in those income restricted units that are created. And so a critical problem we face is that if every new unit we create is subsidized and restricted to only lower income folks, it doesn't actually provide a relief in the housing market for those working folks that are just above those guidelines. So we need a mix of all of it. If there's a time where market rate construction is working swimmingly, we're not subsidizing every project, most projects don't have an income restricted component to them of size, then we can reconsider. I think Salem is an example of a community that recently has introduced an inclusionary zoning policy, but Salem is the fourth hottest real estate market in the country. And that's not to say it's easy to build housing there either, but it's significantly easier than it is in New Bedford. And so I worry that putting one more sort of speed bump along the way to development would make it harder and make our problem harder to solve without much upside. So we already have those income restricted units. Thanks.
I mean, I'll jump in there. I totally agree with everything Josh said when it comes to inclusionary zoning. But to have Renee's back here, I mean, I'll throw out another idea that the city probably won't support either. And that is,
Bring it.
I mean, when you have a market gap and you require more of the developer, as inclusionary zoning would do, is going to just make it more economically unfeasible, as Josh said. And the only places we've seen inclusionary zoning work are the markets where they're really strong and enough to cross-subsidize the more affordable units. So I do think it'd be good to have a plan in place for when the market gets to that point in New Bedford. But for now, the approach I would take is being really clear about municipal tax abatement and the city's willingness to subsidize those units by foregoing property taxes for a period of time, which many gateway cities have done. You know, and the more we're doing that to spur production, at least in the immediate term, one thing that will do is create more rental units that would be accessible to voucher holders. Because right now we know there's a lot of people who have vouchers who can't find an apartment to rent. So even if we're putting more market rate units online, we're helping people with very low income find places to rent that they can afford. And through our research, that's really what we saw is actually the greatest need is the very low income households in New Bedford who are really struggling. You know, an inclusionary zoning unit typically isn't going to be affordable to those households either. So we need more vouchers, clearly. But, you know, until we have more vouchers, the most important thing we can do is produce more rental housing so there's more rental units out there for voucher holders who are fortunate to have voucher to be able to find a place to rent so they don't have to give it back because they didn't find anything.
Renee, do you want to respond to any of what you just heard?
I mean, I just feel like everything is kind of, there's always a but in everything. There's always a bump in the road somewhere when it comes to this. And yes, we definitely need housing for very low income, but right now we only have low income and then high income. We only have the haves and the have-nots. There's no middle income anymore. There's no one in the middle anymore. And I know in other states, the suburbs, what they do is they do rental housing, and they also have a program to rent to own your house. And that's something I don't know if these towns that are surrounding us, no offense, have the guts to do.
I also want to zero in on something we were just talking about a moment ago about this lack of a middle. And you hear it from all the time, people who make too much to qualify for any kind of grant or subsidy or voucher, and yet they also can't afford the cost of housing. How can both of those be true? And this is a question for any panelist who wants to take it.
Well, one thing that comes to mind, Grace, is in Massing's recent work on gateway cities housing, they find that New Bedford has the highest rate of naturally occurring affordable housing. And so those are sort of the prototypical triple-decker apartment that's long been rented in the city at rates that are affordable to folks without any subsidy. So, you know, it wasn't until fairly long ago you could find an apartment like that for $1,000 or $1,200 or $1,300. And those same units now are renting for $1,600, $1,700 or $1,800. It's critical because we've sort of jumped over a key part of our population, some of which is extremely low income seniors, for one example, who might have a Social Security check with $1,500 or $1,600 a month in income, and they used to be able to pay their rent with almost half or more than half of their income, and then, you know, survive the rest of the month with what they had left. And now the rent is just more than their income is. And they were never on a list for a voucher. They were never on a list for public housing, even though Everywhere else virtually in Massachusetts, those folks would have lived in some sort of subsidized or public housing unit. And so we've got this sort of adjustment, this correction. And part of the challenge is, despite all this, New Bedford still has among the lowest rents in the state, if not the lowest rent in the state.
Well, I can just sort of hear any tenant in the room hearing you say that and go, sure doesn't feel low to me.
I totally understand that, right? But when you objectively compare it to other communities, it is. So part of the pressure that New Bedford residents feel and that we have to adapt to and adjust to and build housing to build our way out of this problem is that rents in Taunton might have been $1,800 and now they're $2,200. And rents in Brockton might have been $2,000 and now they're $2,500. And so there are folks that are scratching and clawing and living paycheck to paycheck in those communities that are looking for cheaper opportunities to move around the state as well. And so that's added increased demand even above and beyond what our residents have already faced.
Mm-hmm. Ben, tell us about, Renee, did you want to go ahead?
So that's true, right? It's probably cheaper here, but also the people here are not getting paid as much as they're getting paid in Boston and those areas. And so what it looks like to me is gentrification. That's what it looks like to me. Keeping the people here that can afford the places here and moving those of us that cannot afford to like trying to push them on to suburbs or other places. And people, cities, towns need to be careful what they wish for.
Right before we open it up to questions from the audience, I want to go to Ben first. What can you tell us about how immigration, both domestic and international, how that is impacting New Bedford's housing market?
Well, I mean, I think throughout the country, and Massachusetts especially, we've been one of the highest immigrant receiving states in the country. I don't know if people appreciate that, but I think we've actually been the second highest after Florida for the last several years, which is in some ways very fortunate because without the immigrant population, we'd be losing significant population and we'd have other problems. So, immigrants have certainly been a big part of the increasing number of households. We could talk about that in lots of different ways, but I do think Josh, I think, started at the outset talking about the workforce and the need to train people to help us maintain the housing stock we have and increase our housing stock. And that's something that I haven't seen nearly enough serious attention to. The state doesn't have a strategy when it comes to the skilled building trade workforce. It's working on its housing production strategy, but it's basically going to say we need to double the pace of housing production, and that means we have to double the size of the workforce. And we need to have a real conversation about where all those workers are going to come from. We've got lots of migrants and people who are coming to the country looking for good work and could really benefit from opportunities for skilled training. And we've been spending a lot of time fighting about vocational school admissions policies and not nearly enough time thinking about how we actually increase the capacity and throughput of our vocational schools. There's been creative work done, vocational schools at night, after dark, lots of programs in some parts of the state to create vocational training programs for people whose first language is not English. But I think we need an all of the above strategy. We actually need to quantify what our targets are and hold people accountable for training that number of workers because there's no way we're going to build our way out of this problem without the people to do the building.
And with that, I think we're ready to open it up to audience questions.
Okay, so I got some ground rules here for everybody. You can use that microphone right there. The question should be addressed, if you possibly can, to one specific panelist. When asking a question, please state your name so we know who you are, and please ask the question as succinctly as possible. The question should be in the form of a question with a question mark at the end. And I know you're all going to be very civil and kind. Thank you.
Am I not up?
I think it's so quickly. This gentrification thing is not my first rodeo. I'm going through it potentially a second time. So here's my question. When you're talking about housing, why don't you ever talk about the people who are already here? All I've heard in my 8 years now in New Bedford and my 4-year experience with gentrification is we need more housing stock so we can bring people in from somewhere else who can afford to pay the prices we intend to charge. Meanwhile, there are human beings here, I live in a building filled with them, who don't know if our building is being sold. We just know all of a sudden there's improvements. When it was owned by a local person, we had improvements. It was a decent building. It was bought by an LLC. The place has gone to the pits. Now they're fixing things, but we've already had a buyer walk through. So they're not fixing the building up for the people who paid into their investment and get nothing for their contribution to that investment, but they prepare the building around us so that the locals can see what the people who aren't here yet are going to get.
Joe, thank you for that background. Can you just circle us back to what your question was and
So
which
my question
panelist it's
basically
for?
is, why don't you ever talk about preserving housing for the people who are already here by keeping the rents low? Like, my rent is about to go up. The guy next door went up 40%. Why? A one room goes up 40%. 5%? Okay. 10% maybe. But no, LLCs. So why aren't you paying attention to those of us who are already here and struggling, instead of always telling us about how wonderful it's going to be for the people who replace us? Because as the guy told us from the MBTA, if the price of housing goes up too high because of the train, you'll just have to move somewhere else. I suggest Fall River. That was the MBTA's answer to my question, what are you going to do for the people here? who are
Thank
gonna
you,
be
Joe.
unhoused?
So let's hear from our panelists. Josh, would you like to take that one?
Yes, and you know, with respect to Joe's experiences and how trying it can be to find an apartment and to maintain an apartment, to make it perfectly clear, New Bedford's approach has nothing to do with attracting outsiders in, is more just to meet the needs of New Bedford's residents and to make them more resilient. So the
Thank you, Joe. Can we just let Josh finish, please?
So the only way we can show it is to build more housing units. Adding demand, adding supply to meet demand is the only way to bring prices down. And so we have a number of other strategies that are also attuned to making people more resilient. Increasing home ownership opportunities. We think that there's a potential for a condo market where people can get into the home ownership market and build equity, and then maybe move up to single family home ownership if that's their desire. We've committed hundreds of thousands of dollars already in a first-time homebuyer program toward that end. We've also funded a repair program to keep people in their homes that might otherwise have not been able to afford those repairs. We've increased money for rental assistance dramatically, and we continue to find new ways to do that. We've leveraged resources that the state has made available through RAFT and Homebase and other services and streamlined the way that they're provided in New Bedford to try to keep people in their homes. The reality is this problem, this housing shortage, is much larger than any one city, any one region, frankly. It's a statewide issue. The only way to solve it is to build out of the problem, and so we're committed to doing just that. It's a resilience strategy for our own residents. It isn't to build housing for others. And I think as Ben's report and Massing's work has shown, there is not an influx of people coming from other areas into New Bedford either. So that market is not there. It is still not profitable to build a single unit of housing in New Bedford or most other gateway cities. And so that's the challenge we're up against, and we're committed to solving that.
Ben, would you like to add?
Yeah, I mean, I just, a couple of things. I think what Josh said was absolutely right when it comes to home ownership. A big part of the strategy has to be more of the community owning the community. And in a lot of our gateway cities, it's, less than half, and in some places only a quarter of the people own their own homes. So 3/4 of the community is then up for sale. And especially in gateway cities where we haven't seen investment for 3, 4, 5 decades, we want to see improvements in the neighborhoods, but we want to make sure that that doesn't lead to displacement and the people who've lived in those neighborhoods for a long time benefit. So I think the state hasn't spent nearly enough in our report, and I should have mentioned, I've been speaking this whole time and haven't recognize Elise Raposa, who did all of our research and is a New Bedford resident sitting here listening to all this and probably has a lot to say. But, her most recent research shows that 20% of our rental housing in gateway cities is permanently protected from market forces. Not enough, but a good start, right? Less than 1% of our home ownership stock is affordable home ownership that's insulated from market forces, allowing people to purchase and own an affordable home. And so, the state hasn't really done any work, enough work on home ownership, and we're feeling the impact of that. And then, the last thing I want to say is, in part rents are going up, we know, because insurance is going up, energy is going up, repairs are going up, and, not that all landlords are perfect human beings, but they're under pressure as well, and they have to, in some cases, pass some of those costs off. And we're seeing that in the construction of new property, because you can't finance a new rental development without showing what your operating costs are going to be to the bank. And, those are big numbers, especially if it's an affordable property, because then there's all sorts of resident services you have to provide. So it's not just the energy and the repairs and maintenance and insurance, but resident service fees. So that's why there are these gaps and these really serious market challenges that we all need to work together to address.
Next question.
For Ben, I think, can you just explain more of what a gateway city means? Gateway to what?
And can you just tell us who you are?
Tim Safford from Dartmouth.
Yeah, the gateway city term came to being in a massing report in 2007, where we're looking at older mill cities that are the centers of their regional economies. And at that time, we were thinking about what are these places going to be as we transition to this knowledge economy where we don't make things here anymore, we provide services. At that point, gateway cities weren't really gaining population, but they weren't losing population the way Rust Belt cities in Pennsylvania and Michigan and Ohio and upstate New York were. So, we kind of noted that, and it's kind of been interesting over the last 2 decades that not only have gateway cities not lost population in Massachusetts, they've gained significant population, and they're growing faster than the rest of the state. And that's partly because part of the reason why we call them gateways, not because they're just gateways to regional economies with the hospitals and the colleges and the other major regional economic institutions, but they're very much immigrant communities and always have been. So they're gateways to the United States. And so immigrant communities have been growing, and our gateway cities are growing. And now, really, their most important product is their people. And that makes housing the number one issue.
Any other questions? Come right on up.
Hi, my name is Frances Kearns from Mattapoisett. I've got a 2-part question. The first part is for Chris and Josh, and the second part is for Renee. So what type of communication strategies are towns employing to communicate to residents the programs that you had mentioned that are being offered to help close the gap for housing affordability? And for Renee, what kind of strategies would you like the town to communicate with people in areas to meet them where they're at?
Go ahead.
Just, I guess, to follow up on the last line of questions, just a little context about what Dartmouth has. I know Josh mentioned a couple of the programs. Dartmouth also has a CPC-funded home rehabilitation program. We currently have a state-funded program for rental assistance for residents who are in that 60 to 80% area median income. And we also do have funding through CPC for a first-time home buyer program. With those programs, I know they've seen a lot of variations over the years. And so one of the things that the town of Dartmouth is working on is simplifying our documentation, the program requirements. So when we're explaining the program, it's easy to understand. There's not a lot of hoops you have to jump through in terms of documentation to submit. So just, I guess, the program structure and the documents that we have, the contracts that we have, try and make those as streamlined as possible. The second is, we do have our communications coordinator that works out of the town administrator's office, And one of the things that we really charge her to do in collaboration with the other members of my team is figure out where people are, where's the best place to push these messages. Is it social media? Is it through our newspaper partners? Is it through e-newsletters? We also have a very active local community television, our DCTV programs that do get a lot of visitation. But I don't think it's something that we're stopping and saying, okay, we've done enough outreach. I think we're trying to figure out, A, how we can get more interest in the programs, but B, if we haven't, why? So I know that's something where for some of the programs in recent history, we've sat and we've talked about, well, why aren't people applying to these programs? Why aren't they taking advantage? Is it because the terms of the program are too cumbersome? Does it restrict them? Is it not enough money? Do they want, the deed restrictions on some of the single family homes, for example? So I think it's just an ongoing conversation and hopefully room for growth eventually.
So in your experience with the communication activities that the towns are taking, how are you seeing it on your end in terms of meeting people where they're at in the community to getting this information? And what would you like to see improved?
So I think one of the strategies I would go with is reaching out to the schools, because the schools, it's not like you can't. I mean, social media, I barely look at social media, and some of that is part of my job. I only look when I have to. So it's not something that I'm going to find an advertisement about opportunities for different housing opportunities. The thing is going through the school departments within New Bedford, Dartmouth, Fairhaven, throughout, because there are people everywhere that are looking for opportunities to purchase homes or first-time home buyers is great, but if you can't get the loan from the bank, if you don't make enough income so I think a strategy, if the cities and towns came up with a strategy together where you created a home rent to own, it's like not rent to own, but it's like you get to own your property after 10 years. The deed goes in your name, everything goes in your name if you're, making these payments or whatever on time. But the other thing is trying to collaborate with the Native Americans, the tribal society, and because a lot of that land, especially in Dartmouth, is theirs. So being able to have a conversation about creating housing for, people on those lands, I'm pretty sure they would be more than willing to hear the cities and towns about that. So I think that's, for me, the strategy for communication is sending it through the school system, because that's where we have 1,400 kids that are homeless in New Bedford. Send it through the school system.
Josh, is there anything you want to add about the city's communication?
Yeah, we do a lot. There's a broad base of provider organizations in New Bedford too, and we provide a lot of funding to those agencies and support those agencies in their pursuit of other grant funds as well. And so each of them sort of have their own communication strategies. We certainly try to use social media, word of mouth, and all the other traditional forms of communication to get the word out. I think, specific to, we've talked about, first-time homebuyer programs and rental assistance programs and everything, but I spent a significant amount of time talking about subsidies to developers to get new units built. And regionally, I think in general, we could do a better job, and it starts with towns making an affirmative decision, right, that we want new rental housing here, and then two, sort of putting the beacon out, come and help, come and build housing here. And so I think we see that across the region. We've done that in New Bedford, and I think we hear that the towns are on board and want to be part of the solution. But a lot of the developers we talk to still have some fears that if they set up shop and spend money get ready to take on a project in a town, that it'll meet resistance and won't come to fruition. And so I think getting the word out about places and their willingness to support project applications, to use subsidy sources, to support permitting, getting projects built would go a very long way in getting production to happen in those places. But as you know, these town conversations can be difficult and challenging, and there's a lot of conflicting opinions on the topic.
Very quick follow-up for you, Josh. If I want to apply for one of these new income-restricted apartments on Union Street, where do I go? Like, how do I figure out about that?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we put a lot of that stuff out. I think there's applications actually here at the library. City Hall usually has some. As a condition of receiving funding from virtually all of these programs, certainly all the ones that we administer, developers have to submit a marketing plan. And so when there are lottery units especially, but even when the units are accessible in some other way, developers have to go to pretty great lengths to market those units and make sure that there's affirmative activities to market them and make sure that everybody has access to them. In most cases, there are lengthy waiting lists and lottery systems that are used to select the tenants for those units that are qualified. You could stay tuned to our social media. We share those as soon as we get them. We have a bulletin board in our office. And like I said, the library has some here as well. Most of the developments now have like their own website, their own property management groups that market them. They often have signs outside with phone numbers and websites and things like that. So if you see a project that you might be interested in, or you know somebody that might be interested in, certainly feel free to give our office a call and we can point you in the right direction. But we do try to market those things out as well as they do.
Ben, did you want to add anything? All right, next question.
I do have a question, but I first want to compliment Grace on the admirable clarity with which she wrote a series of articles explaining a very complicated subject. I also want to note how lucky we are in New Bedford to have both a daily newspaper of sorts and a nonprofit news organization. We are one of only a few hundred cities in the country that have reached that level. And if anyone in this room is not supporting the New Bedford Light, I invite you to do so. And I didn't get paid to give that speech. Maybe Josh or maybe Ben, once upon a time in around 1925, New Bedford had 126,000 residents in probably no more units than it now has, and maybe fewer. Obviously, there were people who were bed sharing. There were people 12 to a unit. There were different housing standards in those days and substandards. But what do you see is the importance of changing demographics, both in terms of age and family composition? You talked about the increase in the number of units, but are those smaller family units? Josh spoke of individual older person living in a unit who maybe can't afford it anymore, but at the same time that may be a 2 or 3 bedroom unit that could house more people. So what importance and what level of information do you have about the changing demographics and the opportunities to sort of mine the existing housing stock by moving people around into units that actually may be some more supportive of their needs?
Elise, do you remember? I know we had those numbers in our study. There was definitely data that showed a significant number of people are living in units with more bedrooms than they need. Obviously that's over time. We've seen more of that as the household size has fallen. I don't know that we really have great models to help families move and downsize. I think that's a problem across the state and definitely in the suburbs, and potentially an area for suburban-urban collaboration is to free up some of those suburban homes for families and bring some of the older households in the suburbs to walkable urban neighborhoods. So I definitely think that's an area to take a hard look.
think the point about household formation is a really important one. So that there used to be households of 6 or 7 people. I think of my dad's generation. He had 5 siblings, and they grew up in a three bedroom tenement apartment. And those same apartments now are often occupied by like one person or a young couple with one child. And so the nuclear family has changed. There's more units utilized by fewer people than there once was. Part of our theory of action, right? A lot of the new units that are coming online are 1 bedrooms and 2 bedrooms. There are not a lot of 1 bedroom or studio units in New Bedford generally. And so part of the theory is that by developing some of those households will self-select to live in smaller units that might be newer or nicer in some way, which will free up larger units for families. And so I think that's a common thing that we struggle to understand, right? Like, how does a new construction 25-unit apartment building with rents that are $2,000 a month impact me as a renter of a tenement unit for $1,700 a month? And the answer is, and research has repeatedly shown this, that there's this filtering effect where if you create new units, people will filter themselves into those new units, which will free up other units for other families and ultimately drive the cost down of the tenement style housing, older housing stock that we have. And so there's a ripple effect to this stuff. There's some debate about how quickly that happens, right? So is it a year or 2 after you build a new project, or is it a decade after you build a new project, or somewhere in between? And so that's all part of it. Right now, it's hard enough to make the project work. Developers start from a place of how can I fit as many units as possible into this project to generate as much revenue as possible. And over time, we have to be mindful of that, because there might be a time where we need to get back to developing more 3+ bedroom units. I don't think that time is now, but we can't take our eye off the ball there.
Chris?
And I'll just say, from a suburb standpoint, we're a community with a lot of single family homes. And so, working with our home rehabilitation program, you have a lot of households who are in a situation where they might be on a fixed income. And if there was the opportunity out there to downsize and reduce the cost of living, they might take that versus having to maintain and upkeep a larger 3-4 bedroom home. So I think when it comes to opportunities for, growing families to be able to afford and have the option to go to a home, and on the flip side of that, have a family who might be downsizing, looking for a smaller place, maybe a condo, maybe looking to rent, have a better sense of, their finances. It goes back to housing stock ultimately. So.
Back to questions?
So in my conversations with some folks around New Bedford.
Can you introduce yourself really quickly for everyone?
Elise Raposa, live in the city of New Bedford, work for MassInc, and I'm going to take the liberty to ask a question. In my conversations with people in New Bedford, they see the new construction happening along Union Street, and they assume that it's luxury apartments, both because it's new construction and sometimes even because of the rents that are being charged. I was wondering if you could talk about the source of that confusion and the different levels and types of affordability and just how rents are calculated.
I appreciate the question. I spent a lot of time giving this response. So it's exciting that we have new projects coming online. They look great, in my opinion. I'm proud of our city, so when I see new development happening, it instills this pride in me that we've got this cool stuff going on downtown. But I understand where some residents will look at it and go, hey, like, who's this housing for? That must be going for $2,500 a month or $3,000 a month. Who can afford that? Nobody I know. And the reality is, going back to what I said earlier, almost all, close to all of those units are income restricted at some level. Most of them are around the 60% area median income level. Some are at the 80% area median income level, a little bit higher, and then some are around 100%, which is just the area median income, which is the basically the median income for New Bedford and its surrounding towns for the sort of the average resident by household size. And so if there's a 2-person household moving into a 1-bedroom unit in one of these buildings, they might expect to pay $1,000 or $1,200 a month for those units. And so the perception, I mean, they look great, so I'm glad people go like, wow, that must be really expensive. And they were very expensive to build, But by virtue of the support of the federal government, the city of New Bedford, the state, and often 10, 12 funding sources that go into these projects, the cost to tenants has been underwritten down in most cases to below $1,300 or $1,400, in some cases as low as $900 or $1,000. Some cases utilities are included, some cases they're not, so it gets a little bit complicated. But almost all of them are income restricted. And when we zoom out and look at New Bedford's rental stock in general, we find that almost a third of rental units in New Bedford, so 1 out of every 3 apartments that you see in the city, is subsidized in some way, either with a development subsidy, a tenant with a voucher, or some other program that has deed restricted that property or created income restrictions there. And that's among the highest rates that we see in the state. And so we think we're doing our part in that way. We could certainly use more units at all income levels, from extremely low to moderate to above. But that's sort of how that's calculated. And most of the units that we see coming online are of that variety. To the extent we might be oversaturated in that area and need some more that are in the workforce range, just a little bit above those guidelines, where working professionals who don't qualify for the lower income units can still find a new place to live.
Next question.
My name is Will, and I live in Fairhaven, so I'm going to pick on Chris out of the football rivalry. And because we're both in suburbs, and when I look at your zoning map in Dartmouth, right, I see a tiny bit of pink, about 1%, 2% of the land, which is Paden, right, which is this walkable village. It's the most sought after real estate in your town, right? On a per acre basis, it's probably worth the most and generating the most tax revenue. Just that tiny little piece, right? Then I zoom out and I look at the rest of the town, and most of it is zoned this kind of dark green color. I think it's like single family 2 or something like that. In order to build a house in that big green swath of land, I need 80,000 square feet, I think. It's like 1 point something acres, just to build one house there, right? Is there any discussion of allowing for smaller lot sizes in the rest of the town if Paden is so sought after, right? And that's clearly something that people really want. Why not make more of it? Wouldn't it be better for the town, and it would create more housing as well?
So a few years ago, or a couple years ago at this point, the town had a lot of conversations through its master plan process. So where does the town see itself over the next 5 to 10 years? And when it comes to density, when it comes to location for housing development, that was a big part of that conversation. And so, I think the sentiment, from what I've gleaned, what I've looked back on of those conversations is, it's not that the town is against development. It's where does development, especially density that we're talking about here in terms of the number of units, make the most sense? Where do we have the infrastructure? Where do developers, especially for multifamily that we're talking about, where do they want to go? And just in my short time with the town of Dartmouth, it's not in South Dartmouth. The infrastructure isn't there. It's not necessarily near the highways, the major shopping centers. It's not near where the planned regional development is for transportation. And that, it's a big piece of that. The other bit is when you look at Dartmouth, Paden is one section of a very large community. When you look at our landmass, we're among the top 5 in the state. And so every part of the town of Dartmouth has its own distinct feel. There's a lot of pride in what neighborhood do I live in when I live in the town of Dartmouth. And so with that, I think, ultimately with future development and future housing, you want to complement what's there, not eliminate some characteristics that people find synonymous with a section, whether that's in South Dartmouth or North Dartmouth, which is very rural in feel. So I think that's something where our master plan gives us that guide in terms of where they want to see development first. Future zoning changes, town of Dartmouth is a little bit different in terms of its form of government, where we also have multiple elected bodies. We have an elected planning board, and we have a lot of different boards that would need to weigh into that for future discussions. But I think it's something where outside of big multifamily development, the town of Dartmouth has started having conversations even before the state looked at accessory dwelling units to say, hey, what makes sense? How can we get more density without changing the character, the feel that, we pride ourselves in, so.
Chris, one of the things that Will specifically mentioned was lot size requirements, meaning a lot has to be a certain size before you're allowed to build something on it. Do you think that Dartmouth's lot size requirements need revision?
So that's something that hasn't come up in the planning documents, and I don't anticipate it coming up, at least imminently. Now, that's something where I think as we see the trends, we do our developments that we have over the next several years, and we see, okay, what does Dartmouth need and want? I think additional conversations need to be had. And when it comes to, my role in that, I guess on the administrative side, it's to help our departments plan, to advise when it comes to budgeting on the town side, to provide that information to residents to the best of our ability. And we have a planning department, we have a planning team who spend a lot of time working with consultants to study that and make the best decisions that they're elected to do.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Next question.
Yes, hi, I'm Buddy Baker-Smith. I've been a resident of this community for 37 years, the first 9 in New Bedford and the last 28 in Dartmouth. I'm the chair of the Dartmouth Community Preservation Committee. And so my question is, I certainly heard a consensus from the panel that the affordable housing problem is a regional problem. And we really need to, no one community is going to be able to solve this problem, and each community presents different kinds of problems and limitations in trying to deal with that. But, and I guess I can sort of be witness to the last 37 years, I have never experienced or have not heard tonight any evidence of coming together to actually work regionally. Everybody wants to stay in their little silo, but everybody here on the panel has agreed this is a regional problem, but I haven't heard of any effort or interest in actually coming together for a regional solution. So I would also, my question, which is kind of a challenge, is I understand there's a lot of, having worked in state government for my career, I understand the technicalities of this, working regionally. But the opportunity to work regionally is in your hands today, because the Community Preservation Act allows for regional proposals. We could come together, Fairhaven, Dartmouth, and New Bedford, and develop a response to affordable housing in the region using the CPA fund as the anchor for coming together and doing the kind of collaborative planning that would be necessary, that perhaps the state would then look at this region differently when it had its own voice about what a regional solution looked like. It would mean New Bedford, having the most resources in the CPA, would be willing to invest in Fairhaven and Dartmouth for affordable housing. And it would mean that Fairhaven and Dartmouth,
having the regional,
yeah, Fairhaven and Dartmouth would have to accommodate that development. All of those pieces are within the political will of these 3 communities, using the CPA as an anchor. And so my question is, can you see coming together as a starting point with how to have a regional vision by using the CPA fund as the anchor for that. And could New Bedford even take the lead in that, being the most resourced, both personnel and technically, as well as the CPA fund?
I'll answer for Dartmouth because Buddy representing. Thank you so much. So I know from Dartmouth's standpoint, I know CPC is going to play a major role in the next several years when it comes to housing and how the town of Dartmouth is going to tackle it. We have a really untapped resource when it comes to housing dollars with our CPC funds, and as much as we possibly can, we should spend that, and we should be targeted in our approach of how we're going to spend those dollars. You know, I think, going from, discussing it to taking action on it, I think coming to the table with what are our needs, I think is going to be critically important. Because again, with limited dollars, where are funds and times best spent so that we get the most bang for our buck. So I can certainly see, kind of like I mentioned a little bit earlier, regional applications, complementing CPC funding with other, state or federal funds to advance projects in the area. And I think it really just comes down to, again, laying out what are our needs, what is possible based on what is in the pipeline currently, and then, again, having forums, whether it's like this, whether it's individually, which, Josh and I have met up outside, but talking about those, and then, again, anytime that we can share information, share progress, collaborate, what's on the horizon, that's in our best interest to do, so.
Yeah, I love the idea, and it's in our housing plan. Part of our strategy is to share expertise, to support and share resources. Out of deference to our own CPC and City Council who approve those awards, I can't sit here and say, absolutely, we'll put some money in, but I think the administration would certainly support that. It's definitely geared toward our objectives and goals here. My advice, Buddy, would be this: go talk to Francis there and Will from Fairhaven, and if there's anybody from Acushnet or maybe Freetown or maybe Rochester in the room, grab them before we're done, and lead a charge from the ground up as well, because I think a large part of it is the city is more than be excited to work with towns to help support projects, be it financially, be it through technical assistance or other means, but places have to want to do it, and so that's only going to come from town officials. It can't come from the city saying, we think you should do it. It's just not an effective way to do it. It needs to come from the population, and I think local officials in the towns, frankly, need to feel supported, that there's an interest group in each town that is supportive of these measures, because we've all been part of these engagements and meetings where folks are not in favor of new development. And in those cases, it's tough for town officials, I think, to go out on a limb with something that might be unpopular. And so they need the support of the people. They need people who understand that the state is not going to tackle a housing shortage of 200 or 300,000 units by building all of those units in Boston and in gateway cities. It's just not possible. It's literally not possible. The space isn't there and the economics don't support it. And so some places that have been historically resistant to build will have to build. And so you see that with the MBTA Communities Act, and you see that with the 40B law, however effective that's been. But there's more room for improvement there, and I think that's got to be a priority. But it really is a citizen voice issue. It is not a town official to town official issue. I think Chris understands the dynamics as well as I do in New Bedford, but we all have our own context to operate in, and we have our own folks to work with, and so we have to be thoughtful in how we do it. But having the support of residents who voice those opinions in those master planning sessions at the planning board meetings is really critical, and I can't stress that enough. Elsewhere and in New Bedford as well, we're not immune from those same effects. Thank you.
So Chris, you said it's in Dartmouth's best interest to work with the region. Josh, you said that New Bedford wants to work with the towns around it. One of the recommendations in the Housing for All report was to establish a regional task force for New Bedford and the surrounding towns to work together on a regional housing strategy, which no region-wide housing strategy currently exists. So whatever happened to that task force?
So I'll just, I guess, reiterate what I said at the last set of comments is I think from a Dartmouth standpoint, I think there's a little more of discussions that the town needs to have internally when it comes to its needs. And, you know, like we discussed a little bit earlier, there's the regional approach, but then there's also the requirements that individual towns have to hit when it comes to its affordability 10% threshold. So I think that there are systems in place that require us to do things individually, and then there's opportunities for collaboration on a regional level. I think that when the conversations are had locally and you can go to the table with your definitive, here's what our local constituents have said are a priority. And you can lay those out in terms of short, medium, long-term, you know, high priority, low priority. It can be a better, more informed discussion. So I don't think it is through a lack of want. I think it's just a matter of timing.
Josh, is there anything you want to add?
I would say we're still supportive of the idea of some sort of regional working group or however we can be a resource to the towns. I think we've made our position very clear on what our strategy is here in New Bedford and what we think the strategy should be for the region. And we'll be here, we'll be working on our plan for a long time, and we hope that as others sort of determine what their path is going to be, if there's a way for us to help in that path of producing more housing, particularly multifamily housing, or smaller single-family housing even, in some way, we're supportive of that, and we'll lend every resource we can to that. You know, and I think one example, right, could be it's often less intimidating, I think, to build projects for seniors, and we know that towns have aging populations that are more in need of income-restricted units for seniors than ever, and so I think that's great. Let's build senior projects in the towns, and New Bedford will continue to build family projects for lower-income families, and do that. We'd like that to be shared across the region, but I think there are some quick wins and some easy wins where we can develop multifamily projects in other places and recognize that, you know, everything is okay. It came out well. It's actually contributing to town, and it's helpful. And so we're committed to any regional approach and collaboration that we can be a part of. We certainly subscribe to that notion, and we'll be here to support.
Great. We just have a little bit of time left, so let's get through these last two people standing up. And if you can keep your questions to just one or two sentences, that would be fantastic.
All right, Tom Shire. I'm a homeowner in the North End. A couple observations and a question for Josh, and then another observation and question for you, Grace. When I went to look into adding a fifth unit in the attic of my house, I was told that zoning required that you have 2 parking spots per unit, which would mean my house would need 10 parking spots to add that fifth unit. So I've also noticed that over the years, as homes burn down in the North End, the lots have remained vacant. And I'm wondering if these homes have this same requirement, even though they might be grandfathered, but are they required to then have 2 parking spots per unit? And is this why we're not seeing housing being redeveloped on these vacant lots? And then to you, Grace, a couple years ago, 60 Minutes did a segment on corporate investing in the single-family market. It was called "Would-Be Home Buyers May Be Forced to Rent the American Dream Rather Than Buy It." And when you have a tight housing market and you have these corporate buyers coming in with all cash offers, just that change can really change the dynamic of the market. And soon everybody has to start bidding. It bids up the market. And we end up with people buying homes at inflated prices, having to charge inflated rents to get a return on their investment. So I would like to see corporate ownership of buildings, you know, prohibited for under 5 units. But Has New Bedford Light done any reporting on corporate ownership in New Bedford? Not a week goes by that I don't receive a solicitation from corporate buyers looking to buy my house. And so what has New Bedford Light done in terms of research on that in this market? And what is happening here? How many homes are being bought by corporate buyers? What percentage? And how is it affecting the market?
Yeah, I'll take that one briefly, and then we can get back to lot sizes. I have looked into it. It's a very difficult thing to study because somebody who owns one two-family house can have that be owned by an LLC. And so even if you had a spreadsheet of every property transaction that happened within the last year, 2 years, 5 years, just because it goes to an LLC doesn't necessarily mean that it's being owned by some corporate conglomerate based in New York. You know, mom and pop might just have set up an LLC for liability reasons to own that unit. It's difficult to study is the answer, and so unfortunately I don't really have an answer for you. I think Ben may have looked into this a little bit as part of the Housing for All report. So Ben, is there anything you want to add?
Yeah, we looked at this a lot through the assessor's data, and we didn't see a dramatic shift toward corporate ownership in New Bedford or in other gateway cities, but we hear about it anecdotally an awful lot. So I wouldn't rule it out. I think it is difficult to really understand how these transactions are happening, and I do think the city should work hard to know as much as it can and regulate where it can.
And briefly circling back to that question, just to remind everyone, when we see a triple decker that burns down in the north end and it doesn't get rebuilt for years and years, is that because grandfathered zoning?
It is. Quickly on the corporate ownership point, I can just say at least anecdotally, we don't see a lot of that here. I'm familiar with the 60 Minutes piece. I think that's a problem across the country. Anecdotally, we don't see that here, and I spend a lot of time looking at who owns what property and what's going on there, which is, again, not to say that it's not happening, but I don't think it's happening at a significant scale from certain, as Grace put it, corporation sort of conglomerates. I think there are a lot of LLCs that are owned for, liability or tax purposes for investors, local investors largely, but that's kind of a different story. On your fifth unit that you'd like to add, let's talk. It's my job to help you build that unit and to advise you that there's a process by which you can get a reduction to the parking requirement so that you can get that unit built and we can get it online without you having to have an absurd number of parking spaces. Secondly, the city has proposed a series of zoning reforms and has a series of zoning reforms to come, some of which have reduced the parking requirements around the train stations, and I believe will, in the near future, propose smaller parking requirements citywide. So 2 spaces per unit is really kind of a suburban number. It's a difficult issue, as you can understand. There are some parts of the city that already have a lot of cars on the street, and so if you're adding new development in that area, you want to try to accommodate all the parking on site that you possibly can without a spillover to the street. So it's a touchy issue, but we've made it clear, and it's called out on our housing plan, that we shouldn't prioritize parking spaces over living spaces for people. And so our zoning and our policy should reflect that. As far as vacant lots, we've thought about zoning solutions to that as well. Some communities have what's called an infill ordinance. So one of the challenges in New Bedford is we have these minimum lot sizes as well that can be restrictive. As it happens, the house I grew up in was built in 1922. Back in 1922, we didn't have minimum lot size requirements. You built what you wanted, so you could build a 2 apartments or triple decker building on a 3,500 square foot lot. Nowadays, to build a similar building, you'd need like 12,000 or 15,000 square feet. So, you'd be able to fit 5. Under the old rules 100 years ago, you'd be able to fit 5 of the same house on this parcel now that you'd get 1 on. And so when a building burns down, unfortunately, it becomes a lot, stays a lot for a while, years pass by, someone can't necessarily come along and build that same triple decker. There are some building code issues beyond just the city of New Bedford's control that make building triple deckers challenging as well. But we need a way, we've talked about zoning changes that would reduce the minimum lot size needed to construct a multifamily property significantly from 15,000 to much less. I don't know if it'll accommodate all those 3,000 square foot lots that were built on before, and so I think we need some mechanism to treat those cases a little bit differently. They certainly shouldn't require, if there's 3 apartments, 6 parking spaces when every other house on the street is the same footprint and maybe has none or 1 or 2. And then at the same time, Will had mentioned this, I think, in his point about Paid and Aram, but the spaces that we like, the ones that we gravitate toward downtown, are dense. It is not necessarily easy to find parking all the time. It is walkable. Those are the places that people want to be, largely. And so, if that's where the market is telling us there's a demand for it, then we should remove the barriers to constructing those environments to the best of our ability.
Our last question.
All right, I'm Ned. I'm from New Bedford. Apologies. Apologies because you sort of just got to this in the last question, but I'm kind of curious, like when I look at 2-family houses or some of the tightly packed single-family homes or triple-deckers that were built in the early half of the 20th century, like, I don't know, they didn't have power tools, they didn't have vinyl siding, they didn't have trucks, right? And yet it's gotten way more expensive to build now, which seems like it doesn't make any sense, right? It seems like it should be cheaper to build than it was back then. So if you were, I don't think they call them developers, it's probably just a guy building a house, right? If you were a guy building a house back then, what permissions did you, what did that look like then, right? And what would it look like now to make it as easy to build now as it was back then? Do you see what I'm asking? It's like, if I'm just a dude that wanted to build a house in the South End in the 10s or the 20s, what would I have had to do? Would I have had to go to the zoning board? Would I have had to get a bunch of permissions? Like, do you see what I'm asking? Like, what was the world of building like in the time when it was easy to build in New Bedford?
So Ned, I think we've had a number of leads for Grace to follow up on for potential New Bedford Light stories, but that sounds like a good one. Comparing development 100 years ago to today, I suspect almost all of the regulation that's in place today was not there, 150 years ago. 100 years ago, there's probably something to think about, but I'd be enlightened. I'd love to learn about that. I would throw this into the mix, having largely addressed some of the zoning questions, and we're committed to reforming zoning. There is probably not a multifamily project that's gotten built or is in progress or in our pipeline that doesn't require some sort of variance or parking reduction or something by our current code. And so we need to update our code to be, reflective of the types of projects that we want to see built. Having addressed that, I'll say this. There's a report recently done on the architectural requirements, the building code requirements that prevent a lot of projects from happening because our building code really highly encourages, if not requires, projects that have 2 staircases and long corridors that run through the center of them. And then there's a different form of construction where you have point access blocks with access within, and those are harder to come by. So the report is available, and I think that is perhaps another story to write, is how that impacts us here in New Bedford. So the context of that report and the single stair requirements focuses more on Boston and some other markets. And there are some sort of ridiculous examples where the purpose of that policy is for fire safety, right? You need to be able to get out in case of a fire. But there might be cases where you have to walk like 150 feet from your apartment to get out in that scenario, where even in a single staircase scenario, you'd have a shorter path to egress in a different way. And so to the degree that's an impediment to housing, it certainly comes up in my world. A lot of folks will send me potential properties or lots or buildings or old mill buildings and things like that. And I'm not an architect by any stretch. You do not want me designing the building that you live in. But I've got a good sense of what those folks look for. And that's like almost the first thing they look at, right? Is where's the staircases? Where's the elevator gonna go? Where's the hallway? If I plow the hallway through the middle, do I have enough workable space for units on each side? In some cases you don't, so the hallway's gonna go up against the edge of the building, and then you're gonna get units in front instead, but now you've foregone some usable square footage, you've gotten less units out of the project. And so this is very boring and tedious stuff, and it's perfect that we're getting to it at like 8 o'clock at night. But it's really important. And so, if the takeaways from today are the arcane economics of housing construction and the building code requirements and zoning code requirements that we've never really thought much about are the critical impediments to building our way to having affordable houses for everybody in New Bedford and the region and beyond, then that's a good outcome for this, because that's really the truth of it. So I appreciate your questions and others that have brought those up.
I think that is a great place to end our discussion. Everyone, give a hand to our panelists. Big thanks to everyone on the panel, and thank you, everyone who came out and fueled the discussion with your questions. This was really fantastic. I learned a lot, and I hope you did too. Have a great night.